The office smelled like coal dust and cold ambition. That was the first thing Constance Pembroke noticed when she stepped through the double doors of Kensington Steel, not the mahogany panels stretching floor to ceiling, not the gas lamps burning low against the grey Pittsburgh afternoon, not even the enormous man sitting behind the desk, who hadn't bothered to look up. She noticed the smell. It reminded her of her father's hands. Miss Pembroke. His voice arrived before his eyes did, low, unhurried, the kind of voice that had never once needed to raise itself to be heard. Archibald Kensington set down his pen with the deliberate patience of a man who measured time in contracts, not courtesies. He looked up then, not at her face, but at the leather folder she held pressed against her chest like a shield. "Sit down." "No, please." No gesture toward the chair. Just an expectation, hanging in the air like smoke. Constance sat. She placed the folder on her lap, folded her hands over it and looked at him directly, because her mother had taught her that a woman who looked away first had already lost. He was reading the papers on his desk, not looking at her. "Your father owed this company $43,000, he said. "As of last Thursday, he is no longer in a position to repay it." The words were clean, clinical. He might have been reading the weather. "I'm aware," Constance said. Now he looked at her. She had expected something. Disdain, perhaps, or the particular kind of pity that powerful men wore when they looked at women in difficult circumstances. She had braced for it on the carriage ride over, rehearsed her composure the way she rehearsed hymns, quietly and with great seriousness. What she had not expected was nothing. Archibald Kensington looked at her with the expression of a man calculating the load-bearing weight of a bridge, interested only in the structure, not the view. "Then you understand what I'm offering," he said. "I understand what you're proposing," she said carefully. "I haven't yet decided if I understand why." For the first time, something shifted in his face, not quite surprise, something closer to recalibration. He leaned back in his chair, an enormous leather thing worn at the armrests in a way that told her he spent a great many hours in it, and considered her with the same stillness a man gives a contract he hasn't signed yet. "Your father's mill," he said, "sits on 11 acres adjacent to my eastern rail line. I've been trying to acquire that land for 3 years. Your father was stubborn." A pause. "You come with the land, Miss Pembroke. That is the plain truth of it." Constance looked down at the folder in her lap. Inside it were 3 things. A letter from her father's solicitor confirming the debt, a copy of the deed to the Pembroke mill, and a document she had found tucked inside her father's Bible 2 nights ago, folded small, written in a hand she did not recognize, sealed with a mark she had seen only once before, years ago, in a conversation she was never meant to hear. She had not told anyone about the 3rd document. Not yet. "You're proposing a marriage," she said. "A contract," he corrected. "With the legal structure of a marriage, yes. And the distinction matters to you." "Every distinction matters to me." She looked at him then, really looked, and found that she could not entirely read him. That was unusual. Constance Pembroke had grown up navigating rooms full of men who believed she wasn't listening. She had learned to read people the way some women learn to read music, slowly at first, then all at once, until the whole thing became instinct. Archibald Kensington was a different kind of score entirely. "There would be a clause," he continued, pulling a document from the left side of his desk, sliding it across the wide surface toward her. 12 months. If, at the end of that period, either party finds the arrangement unsuitable, the contract may be dissolved. The debt is forgiven regardless. The mill transfers to Kensington Steel on the day of the marriage. Constance did not reach for the document. "And my family?" she asked. "Your mother and sisters may remain in the Pembroke house on Harrow Street for as long as they require. I will settle a monthly allowance. Reasonable, not generous." "Of course," she said. "Reasonable, not generous." He tilted his head slightly. "You're mocking me." "I'm repeating you," she said. "There's a difference. You told me so yourself." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable exactly. It was the silence before a decision. Dense with possibility, weighted with consequence, the kind of quiet that rearranges things permanently. Then Archibald Kensington did something she had not expected. He laughed. It was short, sharp, entirely without warmth, but it was real, and it cracked something open in the heavy architecture of the room, like a window letting in air that nobody had planned for. "You are not what I anticipated," he said. "No," she agreed quietly. "I rarely am." She reached forward and picked up the contract. She read it slowly, every line, every clause, every footnote written in fine print that most people, she suspected, never bothered to reach. She turned to the 3rd page, the 4th. She read the dissolution terms twice. She noted the penalty structures, the timeline of asset transfer, the language around domestic arrangement. Then she set the document back down on his desk. "I will need one amendment," she said. His eyes narrowed. "This is not a negotiation, Miss Pembroke." "Everything is a negotiation, Mr. Kensington," she said. "You told me that too, or at least I have heard it said of you often enough that I assumed it was your personal philosophy." He stared at her. A long moment passed. "One amendment," she repeated. "A clause protecting my right to manage the domestic affairs of whatever household I inhabit during this arrangement, without interference. That includes correspondence. That includes visitors." It was a strange thing to ask for. She could see that he understood this perfectly well. His eyes sharpened, not with anger, but with the particular attention of a man who had learned long ago that unusual requests always had reasons behind them. He picked up his pen. "Done," he said, and wrote the amendment himself in the margin of page 2, in handwriting that was precise and controlled and left absolutely no room for interpretation. He initialed it, slid the contract back across the desk. Constance picked up the pen he offered and signed her name in full. Constance Elaine Pembroke. The ink dried quickly in the warm air of that room, and when she set the pen down and looked at what she had done, she felt something she had not fully prepared for, not regret and not relief, something quieter than both, something that felt like the closing of one door and the standing in a dark hallway, not yet able to see which way the next door opened. She stood, smoothed her skirt, gathered the folder from the desk. "Miss Pembroke." She had almost reached the door. "The carriage will come Friday morning. The ceremony is at noon." She did not turn around. "Then I will be ready at 11, she said, her voice even and clear. "I prefer to arrive early." She heard nothing behind her. No movement, no word, but somehow in the long corridor as she walked toward the building's front entrance, with Pittsburgh grey and cold beyond the tall windows and the distant sound of his mills already working in the hills, she had the distinct and unshakable feeling that for the first time in a very long time, Archibald Kensington was not entirely certain what came next. She stepped outside. The air hit her face, sharp, cold, carrying the smell of iron and river water. She reached into the inside pocket of her coat and felt the folded edge of the third document. Still there, still secret, still capable, she believed, of changing everything. 12 months, she told herself, and walked toward the waiting carriage without looking back. 12 months to understand what my father knew, and why someone wanted it buried with him. The contract was signed, the mill was gone, and somewhere inside that building, in conversations she had not been invited to, and offices she had not yet seen, the machinery of Archibald Kensington's empire was already turning, completely unaware that the woman who had just walked through its front door was carrying the one document that could bring it all to a stop. Ravenshire was not a home. Constance understood this within the first hour of arriving. It was a statement. 3 stories of pale stone and dark iron set against the Pennsylvania hills, surrounded by grounds that were immaculate in the way that expensive things are always immaculate, without love, and entirely by hired hands. The kind of house that announced its owner's wealth the way a court proclamation did, loudly, formally, and without the slightest interest in how it made anyone feel. A housekeeper named Mrs. Alcott met her at the front door, efficient, white-haired, with the particular manner of a woman who had spent decades navigating powerful households and had long since decided that the safest expression was no expression at all. "Your rooms are on the 2nd floor, Mrs. Kensington," she said. The name landed strangely in Constance's chest, not painfully, not warmly, just strangely, like wearing someone else's coat on a cold morning and being surprised to find that it almost fits. "Thank you, Mrs. Alcott. Mr. Kensington is in Pittsburgh until Thursday. He sends his regards." He had not sent any such thing, of course. Mrs. Alcott had simply been trained to say it, and they both understood this, and neither of them acknowledged it, and somehow that small shared silence told Constance more about life inside Ravenshire than any formal introduction could have. "Of course he does," Constance said pleasantly, and followed her up the stairs. Her rooms were beautiful. This surprised her. She had expected something functional, a bed, a writing desk, windows that faced the correct direction. She had not expected the pale blue wallpaper, or the fire already burning in the grate, or the vase of white flowers on the windowsill that someone had arranged with genuine care, the petals still fresh and slightly damp, as though they had been cut that very morning. She stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary. Then she walked to the window and looked out at the grounds below, the long gravel path, the iron gate at the far end, the hills beyond it going dark in the early evening, and she told herself that beautiful rooms were simply another form of contract, a way of communicating expectations without speaking them aloud. You will be comfortable here. You will be provided for. You will not be unhappy in any way that could be measured or reported. You will also not be asked about. She accepted this. She had known what she was agreeing to. She sat at the writing desk, opened the top drawer, empty, waiting, deliberate, and placed the third document inside it. She locked the drawer with the small brass key she kept on a ribbon inside her dress, next to her collarbone, where it pressed gently against her skin all day like a reminder. Then she unpacked her own things, quietly and without asking for help, because she had learned long ago that the most useful skill a woman could possess was the ability to settle into difficult spaces without making them aware she was doing so. Archibald Kensington returned on a Wednesday evening, not Thursday. Constance heard the carriage on the gravel path from her reading chair near the window. She did not move to look. She heard the front door, heard Mrs. Alcott's voice, and then his, brief, low, the tone of a man issuing instructions rather than arriving home, and then the sound of boots on the stairs. They stopped outside her door, a pause, then nothing. The footsteps continued down the corridor to his own rooms, and the house went quiet again. She looked down at the page she had not been reading for the past 4 minutes. So, she thought, that is how it will be. They met properly at breakfast the following morning. The dining room at Ravenshire was long and formal, a table built for 12 occupied by 2 people sitting at opposite ends, with enough distance between them that a conversation required a deliberate effort that neither of them, it became clear immediately, was entirely prepared to make. Archibald Kensington sat at the head of the table reading a folded newspaper. He had already eaten half of what was on his plate by the time Constance appeared. He looked up when she entered, stood briefly, a reflex of courtesy so deeply trained it operated entirely without warmth, and sat again. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said, and returned to his newspaper. She sat. She poured her own coffee. She accepted the plate that the housegirl brought without commentary. For several minutes, the only sounds in that long room were the quiet ones, silver against china, the occasional turn of a newspaper page, the fire in the grate doing its work. Constance ate her breakfast and looked at the room around her. The portraits on the wall, men mostly with Kensington eyes and Kensington jaws, each of them painted with the specific expression of someone who had never once been told no. The curtains heavy and dark, already pulled back to let in the flat morning light. The centerpiece on the table, a silver thing in the shape of something she couldn't quite identify, clearly expensive and entirely without purpose. "The grounds are well kept," she said. He turned a page. "I pay a groundskeeper. I noticed the rose garden on the east side. It looks like it hasn't been touched in some time." A pause, brief, but there. "My mother planted it," he said. Not warmly, simply as a statement of fact, offered without invitation for further inquiry. "It's lovely," Constance said. "Even without tending." He said nothing. She drank her coffee. The days settled into a pattern the way water finds the shape of its container, without drama and without being asked. He left for Pittsburgh 3 mornings a week. On the days he stayed at Ravenshire, he worked from his study on the ground floor, a room Constance had not been inside and did not ask to enter. Mrs. Alcott managed the household with a precision that required very little of Constance and offered her very little to do, which was, she suspected, entirely intentional. She read. She walked the grounds in the mornings, learning the property the way she had learned to learn things, systematically, without drawing attention to the fact that she was doing it. She wrote letters to her mother and sisters, careful letters, warm and edited, that reported on the house and the gardens and the Pennsylvania hills, and said very little about the man who owned all of them. She spent one afternoon in the library. Ravenshire's library was on the 3rd floor, a room she found by accident, following a corridor she hadn't tried before, and when she pushed open the door and saw the shelves that covered every wall from floor to ceiling, she stood very still for a moment, the way a person stands when they find something they needed and didn't know they were looking for. She was there for 3 hours, before she heard footsteps in the corridor. The door opened. Archibald Kensington stopped when he saw her. He was carrying a glass of something amber, jacket gone, collar open at the throat, and he looked, she registered this quickly and carefully, surprised. Genuinely, unguardedly surprised, the way a person looks when they walk into a room expecting it to be empty and find it isn't. "I apologize," she said, beginning to rise. "I didn't know this room was—" "Sit down," he said, The same 2 words as the office. The same tone. But something underneath them was different this time. Less command, more reflex. She sat. He walked to the far end of the room, to a leather chair near the window that had clearly been used often. There was a small table beside it, a lamp angled precisely. A faint impression in the cushion that told her this was where he came when he wanted to be somewhere the rest of the house wasn't. He sat. He opened the book he'd been carrying under his arm. She hadn't noticed it until now, and he read. And so they sat in the library together, on opposite ends of the room, in complete and oddly companionable silence, for nearly an hour. When the light outside began to change and Mrs. Alcott's voice floated up from somewhere below, calling the household to dinner, Constance closed her own book and stood. She was almost at the door when he spoke. "What are you reading?" She turned. He was looking at the spine of the book in her hands. "Tocqueville," she said. "Democracy in America." Something crossed his face. Quick, gone before she could name it. "My father considered that book dangerous," he said. "And you?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at his own book. "I consider most honest things dangerous," he said quietly. "That's rarely a reason not to read them." She stood in the doorway a moment longer than she needed to. Then she said goodnight and walked down the corridor toward the stairs, and she did not let herself think too carefully about the fact that it was the most he had said to her since the morning of the contract, or about the way his voice had sounded when he said it, less like a man making conversation and more like a man thinking aloud, forgetting, just briefly, that someone else was in the room to hear it. 3 days later, Constance received a letter. It came in the afternoon post, addressed in a handwriting she recognized immediately. Sharp, angular, ink pressed hard into the paper by someone who wrote with urgency rather than care. She knew that handwriting. It matched the document still locked in the drawer of her writing desk. She read the letter standing at the window of her room, the afternoon light falling across the page, and by the time she reached the final line, her hands were perfectly steady and her face was perfectly composed, and the cold that had settled in her chest had nothing to do with the autumn air coming through the glass. The letter said 7 words that changed everything. "He knows more than you think he does." She folded the letter, placed it in her pocket, walked to the window and looked out at the rose garden, the one his mother had planted, the one that grew wild and beautiful and completely without anyone's permission. She stood there for a long time. Downstairs somewhere, she could hear the sound of Archibald Kensington moving through his house, through rooms she was only beginning to learn, in a life she had only just agreed to, and for the first time since she had signed her name on that contract, she felt the full weight of what she was carrying, and what she was running out of time to understand. The letter burned in her pocket for 3 days. Not literally, but Constance had always believed that certain truths carried a physical weight, a heat that pressed against the body the way fever did, quiet and insistent and impossible to ignore, no matter how many ordinary things you placed around it. She went to breakfast. She walked the grounds. She sat in the library with Tocqueville open on her lap and read the same paragraph 4 times without absorbing a single word. "He knows more than you think he does." 7 words, no signature, no return address. Just that angular handwriting pressed hard into the paper, the same hand that had written the document still locked inside her desk drawer, the document she had found folded inside her father's Bible on the night before his burial, tucked between the pages of Psalms like something hidden in plain sight, entrusted to God because there was no one else left to trust. She had not told anyone about it, not her mother, not her sisters, not the solicitor who had sat across from her in his grey office and explained in the careful language of a man delivering bad news he had delivered many times before, the full extent of what her father had left behind. She had kept it because she did not yet understand it, and she had come to understand over the years of navigating difficult rooms and difficult men that the most dangerous thing a person could do with a weapon they didn't fully comprehend was use it too early. So she waited, and she watched. Archibald Kensington was a man of precise and unvarying habits. This was something Constance had noted in her first week at Ravenshire and catalogued carefully in the weeks that followed. He rose before dawn. He took his coffee, black, no sugar, always from the same cup, a plain white thing, no pattern, completely at odds with every other object in that house. He read 2 newspapers each morning, front to back, in a specific order she had identified on her 8th day, the Pittsburgh Gazette first, then the New York financial pages. He kept his study door closed, but not locked. He worked until 7 in the evening on the days he stayed at Ravenshire, and until later when something was troubling him. She knew this, because on those nights the light under his study door was still burning when she passed it on her way to bed. She had passed it burning on each of the last 4 nights. She did not know what was troubling him. She had her suspicions. She was not yet prepared to confirm them. The complication arrived on a Tuesday, in the form of a man named Gerald Whitmore. She was crossing the entrance hall when she heard the name, spoken by Mrs. Alcott to one of the house staff in a low voice that carried further than intended in that high-ceilinged space. Gerald Whitmore, arriving Thursday. Guest rooms to be prepared on the east wing. Constance continued walking without breaking her stride. In her room she sat at the writing desk and unlocked the drawer with the key from the ribbon at her collarbone and spread the document open on the surface in front of her. She had read it many times. She knew it almost by heart now, but she read it again, slowly, because she needed to look at the name printed in the upper left corner with fresh eyes. Gerald Whitmore, in trust, February 1891. The document was a silent partnership agreement, the kind that existed precisely because one of the parties involved wanted no public record of the relationship. Her father's name appeared twice. Kensington Steel appeared once, in the body of the 3rd paragraph, in language carefully constructed to describe a transaction without fully naming it. Her father had been a witness, not a partner. A witness, and a man who had been present at a transaction that, if she was reading the document correctly, and she believed she was, had involved the movement of a very large sum of money between Gerald Whitmore and Kensington Steel in the winter of 1891, for purposes that the document described only as agreed enterprise, a phrase so deliberately vague it told her everything she needed to know about the intentions of the men who had written it. Her father had kept this document for 12 years. He had kept it, and he had said nothing, and then he had died with his mill mortgaged to the company whose name appeared in the paper he had hidden inside a Bible, and she did not believe, not for a single moment, that this was coincidence. The question that had kept her awake since the night she found it was simpler and more frightening than any of the legal language. Had her father been protecting himself or protecting someone else? She folded the document carefully, replaced it in the drawer, locked it. Then she sat very still for a long moment and thought about the letter. He knows more than you think he does. Gerald Whitmore arrived on Thursday afternoon. He was a tall man with a politician's smile. Broad and warm and assembled so quickly, it was clearly a reflex rather than a feeling. He wore his money the way certain men did, not loudly but completely, in the quality of every fabric and the ease of every gesture. And he moved through Ravenshire's entrance hall with the comfort of a man who had been there before, many times before. Constance watched him from the upper landing, her hand resting lightly on the banister, and registered the greeting between the 2 men below, Archibald's handshake firm and brief, his expression closed in a way that was different from his usual reserve, tighter, more deliberate. Whitmore said something low and laughed at his own words. Archibald did not laugh. She descended the stairs at precisely the moment that felt natural. Not too early, not too late. And she watched Whitmore's face rearrange itself when he saw her. The smile shifted, not disappearing, adjusting, recalculating, the way a man does when a room contains something he hadn't prepared for. "Mrs. Kensington," Archibald said, and there was something in the way he said it, flat and careful, that made her pay close attention. "Gerald Whitmore, an old associate." "A great pleasure," Whitmore said, and took her hand. His grip was half a second too long. "Likewise, Mr. Whitmore," she said warmly. "I hope your journey was comfortable." "Entirely," he said. "Pittsburgh in autumn is a remarkable thing." "It is," she agreed. "Though I find the hills more remarkable than the city. There's a clarity to the air up here that the city doesn't have. Things are easier to see." She said it pleasantly. She meant every word of it precisely. Whitmore smiled. "How poetic." Archibald said nothing, but she felt his eyes on her for a fraction of a second longer than usual before he turned and led his guest toward the study. The door closed behind them. That evening at dinner, the 3 of them sat at the long table and performed the ritual of polite conversation with varying degrees of success. Whitmore was practiced at it. He steered topics smoothly, asked questions designed to flatter, laughed at the right moments, and never once said anything that actually mattered. He was the kind of man who used charm as architecture, building elaborate structures of pleasant nothing around himself so thoroughly that most people never noticed there was no real interior. Constance noticed. She asked him, gently and entirely without apparent intent, how long he had known her husband. "Oh, years," Whitmore said easily, "since before Kensington Steel was what it is today. We go back to the early days, don't we, Archie? Archibald's jaw moved slightly. We do. The early days of any empire are the most interesting, Constance said, setting down her fork. Before the structure is established, when the decisions that will shape everything are still being made. She looked at Whitmore with a smile that was entirely genuine and entirely unreadable. Were you involved in the foundational years of the company, Mr. Whitmore? I ask only because I find my husband modest on the subject of his own history, and I am still learning so much. Whitmore's smile held, but something behind it went very still. In a small way, he said. An advisory capacity, mostly. How generous of you, she said, to invest yourself in someone else's success. The word invest landed in the middle of the table like a stone into still water. She watched both men in her peripheral vision without looking at either one directly. Archibald set down his glass. Constance. His voice was quiet, measured. Whitmore and I have some business to discuss after dinner. I hope you'll excuse us. Of course, she said pleasantly. I was planning to retire early in any case. The library has been keeping me up far too late. She folded her napkin, said good night to both of them with equal warmth, climbed the stairs without hurrying. She did not go to the library. She went to her room, closed the door quietly, and sat in the chair near the window in the dark, listening to the sounds of the house below her. The murmur of male voices from the study, too low and too far to hear clearly, the occasional silence that felt more deliberate than the conversation around it. She sat there for a long time. She thought about her father's hands, calloused and ink-stained, the hands of a man who had worked and also recorded, who had witnessed things and kept the record of his witnessing hidden inside the one book he knew would travel with him to his grave. She thought about 12 months and how much of that time had already passed. She thought about what it would mean to use the document now, before she fully understood it, against men who had spent decades understanding exactly this kind of leverage and exactly what to do when someone else held it. Then she thought about Archibald Kensington in the library, collar open, book in hand, saying, I consider most honest things dangerous, in the quiet voice of a man who had forgotten, just for a moment, to be guarded. She did not know what to do with that memory. She was becoming uncomfortably aware that she was going to have to decide soon, because downstairs, in a room with a closed door, two men who both had reasons to want that document destroyed were having a conversation she had not been invited to, and one of them she was beginning to believe had known about it far longer than he had ever admitted. She reached into her pocket. The ribbon was still there. The key was still there. She closed her hand around it in the dark and held it tightly. Not yet, she told herself, but the clock on the mantel ticked steadily in the silence of the room, and she understood, with the particular clarity that comes only at night, that not yet was rapidly becoming very soon, and that when the moment came she would not get a second chance to choose correctly. The document came out of the drawer on a Friday morning, not because Constance had decided the moment was right, but because the moment had decided for her, the way most irreversible things do, quietly and without ceremony, arriving before you are fully prepared and leaving you no dignified alternative but to meet them standing. She had heard them arguing the night before, not clearly, not with words she could assemble into complete sentences from behind her closed door, but the shape of it had carried through the walls of Ravenshire, the way sound always travels in old stone houses, muffled but present, impossible to mistake for anything other than what it was. Two men who had maintained a careful arrangement for a very long time had finally run out of careful. She had sat in the dark and listened to the shape of it, and understood that whatever had been held in balance between Archibald Kensington and Gerald Whitmore for the past 12 years was no longer holding. In the morning, Whitmore's carriage was gone before breakfast. Archibald did not come to the dining room. She found him in the rose garden. This surprised her more than anything that had come before it. The rose garden on the east side of Ravenshire, the one his mother had planted, the one that had grown wild and without tending for what she estimated was several years, was not a place she had ever seen him go. It was not, she had assumed, a place he thought about. It was simply a part of the grounds that existed outside the architecture of his daily life, the way certain memories exist outside the architecture of a person's daily self-understanding, present but unvisited. He was standing with his back to her at the far end of the garden, his hands in his coat pockets, looking at nothing in particular, or rather looking at everything in the unfocused way of a man who was not seeing what was in front of him at all. She walked toward him without announcing herself. He heard her anyway. I would prefer to be alone, he said, without turning. I know, she said, and kept walking until she was standing a few feet to his left, close enough that they were both inside the same silence. He turned his head slightly, looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, not the controlled blankness of their breakfasts, not the recalibrating attention of their early conversations. Something rawer than either, something that had been up all night and had not yet had time to reassemble itself into anything presentable. She reached into the inside pocket of her coat and held out the document. He looked at it. He did not take it immediately. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he recognizes but has not seen in a very long time, with the particular stillness of recognition that precedes understanding. Then he took it. She watched his face as he read. She had learned his face well enough by now to track the small movements, the slight tension at the jaw, the almost imperceptible narrowing of the eyes at the third paragraph, the absolute stillness that settled over him when he reached the bottom of the page and found her father's name. He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully along the original creases. "Where did you find this?" he said. It was not entirely a question. "Inside my father's Bible," she said, "the night before his burial." "And you have had it since then?" "Since before I came to your office," she said. "Yes." The silence that followed was the longest one they had shared. Longer than the library, longer than the dining room, longer than all the careful breakfasts in that room built for 12. It was the silence of something being fully understood for the first time, and she let it exist without filling it, because she had learned that some silences needed their full weight before they could be moved. "Whitmore approached my father in the winter of 1891, Archibald said at last, his voice low and without inflection. "I was building the Eastern Rail contract. I needed capital that I could not publicly source, without drawing attention from competitors who would have moved to block the acquisition before it was complete. Whitmore provided it." A pause. "Your father was present at the arrangement because he held the deed to the land the rail line required. He was asked to witness. He was told it was standard procedure." "Was it?" she asked. "No," he said quietly. "It was not." She looked at him directly. "Was my father at risk because of that document?" He did not answer immediately. This, she had come to understand, was not evasion. It was the way he moved through difficult truths, carefully, the way a man walks across ice he is not certain will hold. "Whitmore came here," he said finally, "because he believes I am preparing to dissolve the arrangement. He is correct. He has spent 12 years holding that agreement as leverage against my silence on certain financial matters that would be of significant interest to the Pennsylvania Banking Commission." He paused. "Your father understood what he had witnessed. I believe he kept the document as his own protection. Against Whitmore, not against me." "And his debt to Kensington Steel?" she asked. Archibald turned to look at her fully then. "Was manufactured," he said, and the words cost him something visible. "Whitmore controls 2 seats on my lending board. The debt was constructed to create pressure. On your father first. Then when he died, on you." The garden was very quiet around them. Constance stood in it and let the full shape of what he was telling her settle into place, not with the shock of surprise because she had suspected most of it, but with the particular weight of confirmation, which is always heavier than suspicion because it removes the last small possibility that you were wrong. "You knew the debt was false," she said. "I suspected it when the numbers were presented to me. I confirmed it 3 weeks after you arrived at Ravenshire." He met her eyes. "I did not manufacture it. I did not know it was being constructed. These are true statements, and I understand if they are insufficient." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because telling you would have required explaining Whitmore, and explaining Whitmore would have required you to understand the full extent of what I allowed to exist in the structure of this company for the sake of a rail contract 12 years ago." His voice remained even, but something underneath it had changed. Thinner, less controlled. The voice of a man who had been honest with himself about this particular failure for some time and had simply never been required to be honest about it aloud. "I am not accustomed to that kind of accounting." "No," she said. "I imagine not." She held out her hand. He looked at it, then placed the document back into her palm. She held it for a moment, looked down at her father's name in the lower corner, his signature precise and careful, the handwriting of a man who had understood exactly what he was signing and had signed it anyway because he had no other choice, and had kept the record of it because he had refused to be entirely without one. Then she walked to the low iron bench near the center of the garden, where a small iron lantern sat, decorative, never used, and she opened the lantern door and placed the document inside and lit it with the match she had carried in her pocket since the morning, because she had understood walking down the stairs that this was how the day would end. She watched it burn. It took less time than she expected, Documents always did. When it was done, she closed the lantern door and stood up and turned back to face him. Archibald Kensington was watching her from across the garden with an expression she had no existing name for. Not gratitude, not relief. Something more complicated than either. Something that had not yet finished deciding what it was. "Whitmore will move against the company," she said. "Without the document as mutual leverage, he has nothing to lose by doing so." "Yes. Then you have very little time, I am aware." "I know a solicitor in Philadelphia," she said. "He is not connected to your current legal structure or to any board that Whitmore influences. He is also entirely discreet and has spent 30 years handling matters that powerful men wished had never come to light." She reached into her coat pocket and produced a card, held it out across the distance between them. "My father trusted him. I trust him. That is the full extent of my recommendation." Archibald crossed the garden and took the card. He looked at it. Then he looked at her, with that attention she had felt on the very first day in his office, the structural attention, the weight-bearing calculation. But it was different now. The bridge had changed, and so had what he was measuring. "The 12 months, he said. "There are still 4 remaining." "I know," she said. "I am not—" He stopped, started again, with the careful deliberateness of a man unaccustomed to the particular terrain he was crossing. "I am not easy to live alongside. I understand this is not a secret." "No," she agreed, "it is not. But I find—" Another pause. Longer. "I find that Ravenshire has felt different since September, and I do not believe that is a coincidence." She looked at him standing in his mother's wild garden, the document ash in the lantern behind her, the Pennsylvania hills going gold in the morning light above the iron fence, and she thought about all the rooms she had moved through in this house, all the silences, all the careful breakfasts, all the nights she had heard his study light burning, and wondered what was keeping him from sleep. She thought about a man who said, "I consider most honest things dangerous," and meant it as a confession rather than a boast. She thought about the contract in the office drawer, the 12-month clause, the terms of dissolution, the amendment written in his own handwriting in the margin of page 2. She thought about her father's hands and the document he had hidden inside a Bible, and what it meant that he had left it for her to find. "I think," she said quietly, "that we have both been managing very large things alone for a very long time." He said nothing, but he did not look away, and in the long, particular silence of that garden, with the ash still warm in the lantern and the roses growing wild around them, and the empire of Kensington Steel already beginning to shift on its foundations in offices across Pennsylvania, Constance Pembroke made her choice, not because the contract required it, not because the 12 months demanded it, not because she owed him anything or feared what came next, or had run out of alternatives, but because she had looked at him clearly, in good light, without the interference of pretense or strategy, or the careful performance of people who are trying to survive each other. And she had found something she had not been looking for, and could not, now that she had seen it, reasonably pretend was not there. She was staying on her own terms, in her own capacity, with the key still on the ribbon at her collarbone, and the solicitor's card in his coat pocket, and 4 months left on a contract that neither of them, she suspected, was going to invoke. She turned and walked back toward the house. After a moment she heard his footsteps on the gravel path behind her, unhurried, steady, following at a distance that was respectful and present, and entirely unlike a man who intended to let her walk alone. The front door of Ravenshire opened. They went inside. Behind them in the east garden, the ash and the lantern cooled in the morning air, and the document that had toppled Gerald Whitmore's leverage cleared her father's name and cracked open the most carefully controlled man in Pennsylvania, was gone completely, as though it had never existed at all. The empire did not fall that morning, but it would never again belong entirely to him.